Thank you, everyone, for turning up, and a very good evening, a very good rain evening. We are here to hear from a very important and distinguished speaker, Professor David Syiemlieh. Um, the context of this talk is about the Northeast, and Northeast has been in the news of late for a host of reasons. And I think that a lot of reactions that come about to the region are mostly half-baked and are ill-informed, and the fact that they remain so is because of a lack of understanding of the socio-political and geographical complexities of the region, the history that it carries, the sociological aspects of that particular region, and it's important to contextualize them in a proper historical context. The fact that we view the Northeast with a particular lens is often borne by the fact that it is often framed by certain historical events, most notably beginning from the colonial era. So in that context, I feel that this talk will shed some very important light as to how has the Northeast, the political lens of the Northeast been actually framed. So I'll just give a brief abstract of the talk, and I'll bring my student Pelo to formally introduce the talk. So we are here to talk about the plan that fell through, Crown Colony for the Hills of Northeast India, concept to collapse from 1941 till 1946. It's based on this book, The Edge of Empire, The Four Secret Plans for Northeast India. In the closing years of the British rule, a secret plan was conceived and discussed at the highest circles for a crown colony, comprising the hills of the Northeast and the tribal and in indigenous areas of Burma. The plan was not implemented largely because it came up for discussion in the last years of the imperial rule. This plan has been referred to in many publications without having access to the actual texts. In 2014, Sage India published on the Edge of Empire, Four Secret Plans for Northeast India. This book includes the confidential notes of two Assam governors, Sir Robert Reed and Sir Andrew G. Clow, and two ICS officers of the Assam administration, James P. Mills and Philip F. Adam, the administrative pattern of the hill areas of the region before independence, and their thoughts for administration following the transfer of power to India. An overview by the author, largely drawn from the archival records related to the Crown Colony Plan, forms the introduction of the book. Today's lecture, The Plan That Fell Through, Crown Colony for the Hills of Northeast India, Concept to Collapse, 1941 to 1946, intends to provide a historical account of this little-known plan. With that, I invite my student Velo to formally inaugurate the lecture.
Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to a special Insight Series lecture hosted by the Humanities and Social Sciences Department at IIT Gandhinagar. The Insight Series lectures began in 2022 by Professor Ashish Khaka with a focus on development and indigenous peoples issues. Previous luminaries who have graced the lecture include P. Sainath, Professor Rashid Khalidi, Professor Mahmood Mamdani, Professor Edgar Nantsono, and Professor Terry Cannon. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Professor David Syiemlieh from Shillong in our midst. Professor David Syiemlieh obtained his PhD in history from the Department of History, Northeastern Hill University, Nehu, in 1985. He taught at St. Edmund's College, Shillong from 1977 to 1979, and at Nehu from 1979 to 2012, where he was the head of the Department of History, controller of examinations, officiated as registrar and pro-vice chancellor. His main areas of interest are Christianity in the Northeast, imperialism, colonial policy and practice. Some of his most acclaimed books are British Administration in Meghalaya, Policy and Pattern, published in 1989, Survey of Research in History on Northeast India, 1970 to 1990, published in 2000. On the Edge of Empire, 4 Secret Plans for Northeast India, published in 2014. Layers of History, Essays on Khasis, Jaintias, published in 2015. And Faith and Hope, Christian Mission and Churches in Northeast India, 2020. Apart from this, he is also credited with discovering the date of death and other details of the last days of Tirot Singh, the Khasi chief of Nongklaw, who resisted British colonial expansion, and discovering the grave of Thomas Jones in Calcutta, who was the first Welsh missionary in the Khasi Hills. He is a recipient of the Charles Wallace Grant for Research in the UK, India-France Cultural Exchange for Research in Paris, and the Senior Fulbright Fellowship for Research in the US. He was also affiliated with Notre Dame University in Indiana, US. Professor Syiemlieh was the president of the Northeast India History Association from 2010 to 11. As sectional president of the Modern India section of Indian History Congress, he delivered his address at the 73rd session held in Mumbai in 2012. He was also the honorary director of the Indian Council of Social Science Research, Northeastern Regional Center. He was appointed as the Vice Chancellor of Rajiv Gandhi University, Arunachal Pradesh in October 2011. In 2012, he was appointed by the President of India as a member of the Union Public Service Commission, Delhi. And on 4th January 2017, he was appointed as the chairman of UPSC. Since retiring in January 2018, he continues to deliver lectures, mentor students, and conduct research. Today, he will be talking to us about a very important topic of the plan that fell through, Crown Colony for the Hills of Northeast India, Concept to Collapse, 1941 to 1946. Please join in with me in welcoming Professor Syiemlieh to IIT Gandhinagar. Let's all clap and welcome him. Professor Syiemlieh, the floor is yours.
Dear Professor Ashish, thank you for inviting me to IIT Gandhinagar, because this is an IIT and this is not an association where you have crowds like the Indian History Congress, where there's a tussle for reading out one's paper in the 5 minutes. I remember going to one of the Indian History Congress sessions in Delhi, and I had just time enough to say my name, the title of the paper, and there was a thank you. But between me and somebody else, the other person was a more renowned historian and got 20 minutes. I thought that was unfair. But please hold on while I speak on a topic which is of tremendous passion for me. I had first worked on the Crown Colony, a small section of my PhD submitted in 1985 to Nehru. I had collected material from Teen Murti, from India Office Library, London, and from various other libraries in the region. And it gave me an idea that I should develop that further. But it was a good 10 years before On the Edge of Empire was published in 2014 by Sage. Unfortunately, even if you want a copy of it, you will have to read it from the library rather than acquire a copy of it, because Sage has discontinued its book publishing. But you could get a Kindle version of it, and I will look the other way. A little bit on the title of the work, On the Edge of Empire. A title of a book is extremely important for readers to capture the sense in the briefest form of what the book is about. And I thought I should call it On the Edge of Empire because the book relates to the end of empire in time and both space, 1941 to 1946, which were the closing years of British imperialism in India, and the breakup of empire, including the Northeast. In 2012, Sage India published On the Edge of Empire, 4 British plans for Northeast India. These were confidential notes of 2 Assam governors, Sir Robert Reed and Sir Andrew Clow, and 2 ICS officers of the Assam administration, James P. Mills a renowned anthropologist, and his successor, Philip F. Adams. They wrote on the proposal for administrating the hill areas of the region before and after independence. The book has a long introduction by me. This formed the text of the book. The reviews soon after the publication were both impressive and were both appreciative and critical. I like the critical part of it. And one of the things that I did was I took the Hindu's caption for the review. I can't tell you who the author of that review was, but he called it The Plan That Fell Through. So I culled that and brought it into today's lecture. It's okay. Shweta has done a marvelous job of doing a PowerPoint presentation. There's a huge difference, however, in the brevity of the PowerPoint presentation and my longer version. So I will read it out and Shweta will be shifting the pages. The purpose of making this shorter version of the title of the book is to situate the hill areas of the Northeast. Shortly before the transfer of power in 1947 and prior to the process of integrating the hill region into the Indian Union. In doing so, it will partly answer why the integration of some of the hill districts into Assam and India was not as smooth as might have been desired. Further, it suggests that the neglect to consider several British options on the future and demarcation of the hill areas into an independent India was in part the Assam problem in its relation with the hill people. I notice very sadly that the 4 plans were not taken up at all by the new Indian administration in 1946-47. They were shelved, and shelved to the extent that there were only rumors of what the plan was without the detail. And one crazy historian, without any source of the plans which are being presented today, said there was a Christian conspiracy. I mean, and it might delight many today to go back to the Christian conspiracy. Were there any conspiracy at all? I find nothing of it. This presentation makes no attempt to support or advocate the Crown Colony, only that it had in it a feeble and ill-timed bid to do something for the political future of the Hill people. Let's go to Reed's plan. Oddly enough, the first people who Reed announced the plan to, soon after it was published by the publication division of the printing press in Shillong, were school children at the Welsh Mission Girls High School in Shillong on 13th November 1941.
Recording in progress.
He told the audience, their parents, teachers, and guests that India was on the threshold of great change, and I will quote, "Where do you come into this picture?" he asked his audience, largely schoolgirls, surely did not know what to answer. He then went on to say, "It may be it is no new thought, for it has been canvassed in the press often enough that the destiny of these hills and other areas of Assam will follow another course than that of being linked with those of India proper. It may be otherwise, but sooner or later the question is going to be canvassed, and the decision will depend in great measure on public support." On public support. He did not get public support because he did not approach the public. It was a confidential plan right through 1941 to 1946. What motivated Reed to write a note on the future of the present excluded, partially excluded, and tribal areas of Assam? There were 3 areas of the hill areas which were categorized by the Government of India Act 1935. Excluded areas, partially excluded areas, and tribal areas. The excluded areas were the Naga Hills and the Lushai Hills. The partially excluded area were the Khasi, Jayanti, and the Garo Hills, including the Mikir Hills. And you had a small tribal area an area between the Nagaland and Burma known as the tribal areas. For some weird reason, this area was called the unadministered area. Unadministered by the British, yes, but administered by the people themselves. The British did not come down to that level of understanding that the tribes were managing their own affairs. But for the British, well, it was unadministered. Very sad interpretation. That he wrote it after traveling around the province of his charge, meeting deputations of tribal leaders, consulting the district deputy commissioners and the officials in the Assam administration, there is no doubt. And if one wants to read up further on Sir Robert Reid, one could go into his biography, Years of Change in Bengal and Assam. It's a delightful text, and I would urge anybody who wishes to follow this lecture to go to Reid's biography. A hint comes in the very first paragraph where he writes, "The identity of the countries with which they march and their importance from the point of view of strategy and international politics are factors which cannot be overlooked." A footnote to this opinion clarified that in his mind, and I quote again, "Problems arising out of the Sino-Japanese War and the World War of 1939 have underlined the importance of the Northeast in its relations with Tibet, China, Burma, and Japan." It's easy to understand why Tibet, China, and Burma, because these were territories that abutted on British India. But he also includes Japan. And it was Japan in 1942, as you know, that came close to the frontiers of India, a history that is well documented. As a build-up to his plan, Reid reviewed the pattern of administration of the excluded areas, the partially excluded areas, and the unadministered tracts between India and Burma, that is before the Government of India Act 1935. He drew much from the memoranda of N.E. Pari, who had earlier been Deputy Commissioner of the Garo Hills and later Superintendent of the Lusai Hills, and Dr. John H. Hutton, for many years Deputy Commissioner of the Naga Hills, who wrote in the Indian Statutory Commission report of 1930. Hutton's view, and this is important, was that the hill people were racially, historically, culturally, and linguistically different from the people of the plains of Assam, while the administration was wholly on different lines. Both he and Parry had suggested to the Commission the formation of a northeastern frontier province to comprise of as many of the backward tracts of Assam and Burma as could be conveniently included in it. So what Reid does is, taking the cue from N.E. Pari and Hutton, changes the idea of a northeast frontier province into a crown colony. Reid believed the boundary between India and Burma, which only in 1935 was separated and from Indian administration, was artificial as it is imperceptible. Reid revived Hutton's plan of a Northeast Frontier Agency, province or agency, embracing the entire hill fringe from the Lushai Hills and Lakher land in the south, in a crescent shape round to the hills of present-day Arunachal Pradesh, including Chittagong Hill tracts, including the Naga Hills, also including the Chins of Burma and the Shan state in Burma. Also considered for inclusion were the 25 Khasi states and Manipur, and the unadministered territory of which I've made mention. He estimated that the population of the agency, excluding the hill areas of Burma, would be 2.5 million. The most significant departure of Reid over Hutton's plan was that while the latter proposed the Northeast province or agency would be administered by India, Governor Reid wrote, and I would quote, that he would put this under a chief commissioner, and he in turn would, I imagine, have to be divorced, as is Burma, from the control of the Government of India and put under some appropriate department at Whitehall. So he's talking about changing the plan of Hutton under the Indian administration to an administration administered by Britain from Whitehall. He visualized that the form of polity would be on self-governing lines in the way outlined in Hutton's note of 17th March 1928. This was a note sent to the Simon Commission. Institutions of this kind in the plains are as good as dead, he wrote, but in the tribal areas they are untouched and working. And I continue. Elders or chiefs and their advisors settle the vast majority of disputes. Villages have their own funds, and village roads and bridges are kept by communal unpaid labor. Each village is a self-governing unit, but there are unmistakable signs of willingness to combine into larger units. The Lushai Hills have the nucleus for this. One must appreciate that all four of the plans, which I'm now taking up first with Reed, have an appreciation of the tribal administering themselves in indirect administration, in what was called indirect administration, or for the British, a paternal form of administration. He admitted finance would be difficult, as these hills, except the Jayanti Hills, were deficit areas. Were the scheme to take effect, he continued, this agency would have to draw finance from imperial sources, for which there were precedents in the history of crown colonies. And I mentioned Swaziland and Basuto land in a different note of mine. There was precedent for the imperial sources financing the crown colonies, as was done in Africa. The proposed province, Reed suggested, could be manned by an expanded Burma Frontier Service, not an Indian civil service, but a Burma Frontier Service. The amount of control would undoubtedly have to be very considerable for a time, but it is essential, he said, that it should come from Whitehall and not from India, to which the hill tracts are entirely alien. Reed admitted that what he had drawn up was only a tentative proposal in broad outline, for which much detail would have to be filled in. But supposing it was decided, he said, for whatever reason that the scheme he had outlined were impracticable, he trusted that he had sufficiently explained that to place the hills under the control of an Assam ministry was impossible and unworkable. Placing it under Assam was unworkable and impossible. We'll see a similar line of thought coming from Mills. Copies of the confidential notes soon reached Sir Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy, and L.S. Emery, the Secretary of State for India. The latter was so impressed with the plan that he gave a copy to Professor Reginald Copeland, who used it in his third and final volume on the constitutional problem in India. Was there a problem? I mean, title again. I mean, these are aspirations, but it's looked upon as a problem. Anyway, the name of the book was The Future of India, Oxford University Press, London, 1943. And what I found was the note, Reed's note that went from Lord Linlithgow and L.S. Emery to Reginald Copeland, who used it in his third volume on the constitutional problem in India, and it is mistakenly credited with changing a private and confidential report into a scheme that took his name. In some books which don't even follow Reginald Copeland's text, nor the plans which I'm reading out today, they refer to it not as the Reed plan, but as the Copeland plan, simply on the basis of one document, which was the Future of India. When asked for their views, the opinion of the Burma administration then housed in Syiemlieh. In 1942, the British evacuated Burma, and they were housed in a hotel in Syiemlieh. When asked for their views, the opinion of the Burma administration then housed in Syiemlieh following the evacuation from Burma was divided. H.J. Mitchell, the chairman of the Commission on Scheduled Areas of Burma, was not in support of Reed's plan. His personal views influenced the Burma administration. However, it did not influence the governor, as we shall presently see. And this is interesting. The plan was discussed by L.S. Syiemlieh and Lord Wavell shortly before the latter left England to take charge as Governor General of India. And also it was discussed with Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, Governor of Burma, then in London, to discuss Burma's future. Wavell sometime later saw Reginald Dorman Smith in Shimla and discussed a number of points with him. The most important was the governor's idea that the tribal areas of Burma, Assam, and possibly Bengal should be formed into a separate unit and administered by the Governor General or by the Governor of Burma. So you see, there was a further development now including certain areas of Bengal into the colony or the protectorate. This was at the very highest levels of administration in London. Shortly thereafter, Wavell was credited with taking home in 1945 a plan for a province to be solely ruled by Britain. And this I get from Nicholas Mansurg, The Transfer of Power, Volume 5, which is a wonderful collection of documents on the transfer of power between 1941 and 1947. Meanwhile, discussions through 1943-46 on the question of administrative amalgamation on the Burma and tribal areas was underway. A matter of concern was the readjustment of the frontier between Burma and India and the tribal areas and the desirability of some system of coordination of administration. It is sad that people of a similar tribe are separated between Burma and India. India did not give serious consideration to this between 1941 to 1947. Neither did the British when they handed over Burma for its independence in 1948. But at one point of time, there was a talk on administrative amalgamation. Representatives of the Burma administration viewed that distinct tribes should generally not be divided into two administrations, and the boundaries should be drawn on to bring as far as possible the whole of a tribe under the government, which already had included in its territory the majority of a tribe. I'm looking at Thongi. You're doing a work on something of what I'm saying. So you could follow up this lead. It will stimulate your thought on amalgamation. Reed's belief that the plan he had revived would be canvassed was, however, limited to discussions between the officials of the India Office Library, India Office, London, and Burma and Burma. I'm having a little problem. I have a little eye problem, and the vision is getting blurred. My sebaceous glands are leaking out, and very often it looks as if I'm crying, but I'm not. I'm delighted to be here. Reed's belief that the plans he had revived would be canvassed was, however, limited to discussions between the officials of the India Office, London, India, and Burma. Public support, which apparently was not sought, meant that the plan did not percolate to the people who would have been affected were the plan implemented. Some tribal leaders did get wind of the plan. Reverend J.G.M. Nichols Roy, a member of the Constituent Assembly and member of the representing the Khasi Hills in the Assam legislature, submitted a memoranda to the British Cabinet Mission in which he categorically stated that the protectorate would not be viable. And he writes, "When the whole of India will get independence, the hill people of Assam should get their own share of independence, and they should be connected with the province of Assam." So he projects the view that the Khasi and the Jaintia people should be brought in under an Assam administration. Another clergyman thought differently, Reverend L. Gutfor, representing the Jayanti Hills, hoped his hills would, would come into the protectorate. Three Garos wrote to the British parliamentary delegation in February 1946, saying that they had heard rumors that a plan was being considered to exclude the Garo Hills from Assam and India. They opposed the plan. Naga's meeting in Kohima in early 1945 asked to remain under the British colony with their own legislative council. The Mizos of the Lushai Hills voiced their own disapproval of the plan. They favored autonomous status for the Lushai Hills within the province of Assam. Now to move to Governor Andrew Clow. In terms of date of the plans, Mill's report comes before Clow. And not that I'm trying to link up one governor with another and to give them the respect, because they are human beings just like anybody else. I just thought that I should put Mills a little later to give some variation between the flow of thought of Reed, Clow, and Mills. To now move on to Sir Andrew Clow. While the tribal leaders in the hill areas were getting increasingly drawn into discussions on the future status of their hills, Reed's successor, Andrew Clow, the last British governor of Assam, published in October 1945, The Future Government of Assam, Tribal People. Note the difference in the title of the notes. The Future Government of Assam, Tribal People. Prepared between October 19 and March and October 1945, the memorandum demolished Reed's proposal, first by suggesting alterations in hill area administration, and secondly, by giving his personal view on the matter. He made it clear that the time was not opportune for such a proposal. It seems almost unlikely that a British government which is prepared to set India and Burma on self-governing footing should now undertake the administrative and financial responsibility for a patchwork of sparsely populated hills lying where these hills do. Indian opinion would be equally strongly opposed to the constitution of a foreign territory within its natural boundaries. To ask an Indian government to contribute towards the maintenance of the amputated member would be regarded as adding insult to injury. Clow preferred a merger of the hills and plains of Assam in a manner which would conserve tribal rights. So what Clow is thinking is, after demolishing Reed's plan, he wants the hill areas to be brought under an Assam administration. The last paragraph of the governor's memoranda sums up this thought on the matter, and I will read it. It's a rather long quotation. Assam is never likely to be as homogeneous as other provinces, and it will never remain homogeneous even today. The plains people are not so divided as those of the hills, but they are far from being a single people such as can be found in many equally large or larger parts of India. But this great collection of people in hills and plains have been set in a particular well-demarcated corner of the world, and their welfare will depend on their proving able to live together, being able to live together. Assam should look to her diversity and to her capacity for toleration, which is greater than that of other provinces, to provide her strength. This is a very brief presentation of Andrew Clow's views. And very recently, I was able to read up Colin R. Alexander, Administering Colonialism and War, The Political Life of Sir Andrew Clow of the Indian Civil Service, written by the great-great-grand-nephew of Andrew Clow. I was dismayed to find very little on the Crown Colony, and it's pretty irrelevant the way Alexander Alexander has made his presentation. But I must tell you, as I did yesterday, how I got Andrew Clow's note. We historians have the ability to sniff and to find and to dig up and to unearth and then to piece together into an account which is intelligible enough. I went to one of the libraries in Delhi to search for Andrew Clow's book, and I got it. A wonderful red copy, rebound again after many years of almost being tattered and used by many scholars. And I asked for it to be photocopied. I was denied the photocopy other than 1/3 of the book, which I got photocopied immediately, paid the money, and my mind worked very fast because a colleague of mine was going to Delhi 2 weeks later. And I gave the reference of that book, and the next 1/3 was photocopied. A year later, a research scholar was going to the same library to do research and completed the collection. We did not violate any rule, let me tell you, because when you are historians and you have to get the material and you have to use it for your text, you will find means how to do it, and I did so. Now to move to Mills. James P. Mills, advisor to the governor of Assam for both Governors Reed and Clow, was also at work to settle the issue regarding the Hill Area Administration. He too published in 1945 a small but very concise tract, a note on the future of the hill tribes of Assam and the adjoining hills in a self-governing India. Please note, there's a change now in a self-governing India, because by 1945, it was well set that Britain would be leaving India. After reviewing the indigenous tribal administrative systems, the historical background, the racial and cultural setting, and other related matters, he put down his views of the possible alternatives of the relationship between the hills and the plains of Assam. He ruled out that it was in the best interest of the hill tribals to be included in Assam, at variance with Andrew Clow, as has been noted. An alternative appeared to him to be a choice between the two extremes of excluding only some of the tribal areas and to including only the partially excluded areas. Another alternative was to temporarily extend all the hills of Assam with special treatment designed on the lines of indirect rule, to develop these institutions which still survive and to fit the tribals for eventual union with the province of Assam. Eventual union with the province of Assam. If the hills were to be separated from the plains, Mills continued, the two alternatives were either to form a province composed of districts, frontiers, tracts, agencies, and states, or to form a union of states from the outset. He strongly favored the second alternative. Giving some outline to the scheme, he suggested that homogeneous areas could be termed states, such as the Abor state. The Abors are the old term for the Nishis living in central part of Arunachal. And just listen carefully to the other suggestions he gives. He wanted an Abor state governing all the tribes included under the term, a Lushai state, a Naga state, a Khasi state, which interestingly would include the Garos and the Jaintias. Within this union of states would be substates, a term borrowed from the Burma context, where small or intermingled tribes had been combined into a single substate. And it's very interesting that as early as 1945, here was Mills writing in the governor's house, looking far, far ahead at the emergence of states to be, because the Abor state has become, I'm asking, Arunachal, part of Arunachal. The Naga state has become Nagaland. The Lushai state has become Mizoram. And the Khasi state has become part of Meghalaya. So as early as 1946, you have, and I've not seen it being used anywhere in documentation of this very encouraging note of Mills in 1945. Full use could be made of existing customs and institutions such as the village council by keeping power in ordinary affairs as local as possible. He was an anthropologist, please note. With regards to staff, each state would require a political officer with an additional political officer in the larger states. 2 officers with the status of commissioner for the charge north and the south of the Brahmaputra could oversee the administration. And I have underlined this section, the object of the administration being to guide rather than to govern. To guide rather than to govern. Mills wanted the administrative staff to be as small as possible. In line with the principle of paternal administration, the aim, he believed, ought to be indirect rule rather than administration. So for several reasons, Mills ruled out Shillong as the possible capital of the Union of States, including the possibility of Shillong remaining the capital of the province of Assam and the difficulty of having an airstrip nearby. He preferred Imphal. Imphal appeared to him to offer better advantages. From there, the states could be reached by air. Tripura and Sikkim, if included, could be reached with equal ease. The only problem with Sikkim, I find, was there is a geographical space between Sikkim and Northeast India. In one of his footnotes, Reid does mention a possibility of Sikkim coming into the Crown Colony, but he does not include that stretch of territory which is Bengal, linking up North Bengal with Assam. And this situation continues today. Sikkim is part of Northeast India. Not so much geographically because, and culturally, because there's a big difference between Sikkim and Northeast India, but for administrative and political reasons. Let's move to Adams' note. Though the talk had placed 1946 as the close of the Crown Colony plan, it may be of interest to include the views of another officer. Philip Francis Adams arrived in India as a young ICS officer on 14th December 1937, and was amongst the last of that cadre of officers recruited for service in India. Adams was for several months before he demitted office, advisor to the governor of Assam, a position he filled after Mills put in his papers. We may assume that it was while he was in this office and perhaps working on the same table that Adams wrote, and here again, please note on a policy for the hill tribes of Assam. Note on a policy for the hill tribes of Assam. The 19-page tract was printed on 5th August 1947, 10 days before India's independence, by which date Adams had resigned from service. I could not follow up his career, but I believe he went to Tanganyika in Africa to continue serving in the colonial office. Adams' note is quite different than Reid, Mills, and Clow, for he does not go into any detail and makes little reference to any one of the hill people. In this delightful and insightful note, he sums up much of what the policy for the hill tribes should be. He makes no reference to the other 3 notes. He writes in his introduction that the future of the backward people, this is a derogatory term. The British use very strong and derogatory terms, backward. And I have in my collection a note from the Jayantias being very sorry that they are being called backward people. He writes in his introduction that the future of the backward people, and I put it in quotation because it's not my thought, including the tribes of the Northeast, had suffered considerably from the lack of any coordinated and consistent policy towards them. In the absence of any central authority, please note he's now talking not of Assam, but a central authority over them, the policy towards these people had been left to the provinces concerned. The consequences, according to him, was that they received somewhat sporadic attention, being overwhelmed by other political and administrative questions. So what Adams is trying to impress on just before he demits office is that there is no real clear policy by the Assam government or by the government of India regarding their administration and their future. Adam observed that the tribes of Assam are a distinct racial stock and they in no way formed a cohesive political unit. So he did not believe that they formed a political unit. To this situation was the reality that all the hill districts were deficit areas and were in no position to manage the cost of administration. Surrounded as they were by dominant neighbors, Adam believed that it would be impracticable, even if desirable by some sections, to establish the hills as independent areas. To his mind, union of the hills with Burma was impractical, other than those contiguous to that frontier. He must have been thinking about the Chins, the Kukis, and the Nagas, making a comment like this. Communication was linked with India. This is a very short sentence, but it had tremendous impact. Communication was linked with India. Moreover, Burma was not would not in all likelihood take on the responsibility to bear the cost of the administration of these hills. Adams was very practical. By the time he wrote his note, preparations were on for the transfer of power from Britain to India. Everything seems to point to the conclusion that the union or linkage must be with India, he wrote. And like Clow, he suggested that the arrangement be made to allow the cultural and racial differences of these areas with those of the plains within a framework of political unity. He must have kept in mind over here Gopinath Bordoloi's committee report, because at that point of time, the Constituent Assembly was working and Gopinath Bordoloi had made a visit to the Lushai Hills. And he writes, "It is with India that their ultimate union must be." Adams was of the opinion that the hill communities should be integrated with the province of Assam and that the center coordinate policy. Here again, he stresses the coordination of policy by the center. Adams appeared to have had an idea of the social problem of tribal societies undergoing change and the need to have a study of the communities before policy be implemented. He was of the opinion that as long as the administration lacked detailed knowledge of communities, the administration could do little more than guide its main lines of development. Conclusion. Meanwhile, Reginald Dorman Smith, governor of Burma, despite the advice of his officers, continued to be drawn to the plan and admitted, in a very interesting note, are flirting with the Reed idea of a separate agency for the Burma-Assam frontier. I use these words, sometimes I use my text to put the topics of my papers that I write. And drawing from Dorman Smith's flirting with the Reed plan, I wrote a paper in a very fine volume in memory of a great political scientist, Venkata Rao, who taught in Guwahati and at Nehu. He was a dear person, Venkata Rao. He taught in Nehu for about 10 years without pay, without any money. He was a bachelor, and just before his death, he called me. He said, "David, come." He said, "I want to make a donation to NEHA, Northeast India History Association. Let me accumulate my pay from Guwahati University and I will give you the money," which he did. He put together a check and we now have an endowment in the name of Venkata Rao. A very endearing man. He dressed very shabbily. And the love of Venkata Rao was such that one winter, 4 or 5 of us at Nehu put together money to buy him a sweater. And The sweater was never washed, believe me, and slowly the sweater loosened and came down to his knees. He looked pathetic in it, but his heart was a lovely heart, a lovely warm heart, and we hold him close to our love and memory. How was the plan closed? On 6 May 1946, Patrick Lawrence, the Secretary of State for India, recorded a minute. At the present stage of proceedings, agreement has been reached by the Secretary of State and the Viceroy of the impracticability of transferring responsibility for the backward tracts from the provinces to any outside authority, whether that be a British High Commissioner or a United Nations mandate. And it's very interesting that this minute, which comes in a green note sheet in the India Office Library, has a ribbon which you close that file and there is nothing more to write on it. It's as if there was a closure not only in the record keeping, but also on the plans in the geographical space. 4 months later, a question was asked in the Indian Legislative Assembly whether it was a fact that a proposal by the advisor to the governor of Assam for tribal areas was under consideration for forming a separate area to be named Northeast Frontier Agency and to be placed under the Crown and not to be included in the Constitution of India. Jawaharlal Nehru, then member of External Affairs, replied that there was no such proposal before government. The Secretary of State for India and Burma, Patrick Lawrence's minute of 6th May 1946, therefore sealed the fate of the Crown Colony for Northeast India, with the hill areas of Burma, including the plains of other backward areas. With Prime Minister Clement Attlee's Labour government committed to India's freedom, an enclave of a Crown Colony for the hill areas was not possible, apart from it being ill-timed and conceived rather late to enable it to take shape. Moreover, the motives underlying it would have been grossly suspected by the new Indian leadership. The British plan for the hill areas was either shelved or ignored, if not set aside by the new Assam leaders. Council had been carefully prepared by those who had left and quickly ignored by those in authority after 1947. As for the hill people and leaders, their views mattered little. The views mattered little. Nobody was bothered about the hill area people. Events after 1950 were to show just how understanding India's former administrators had been towards Northeast India. Kublai. Kublai is one word which means Kurku Ublai, God be with you. Whenever we meet for the first time, we say Kublai, and when we finish a discussion like this and depart, we say Kublai. So I've given you my blessings in Kublai, which is a Kasi word. We can now have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor David, for that really engaging and very layered discussion. I think it just comes back to my point, which I had begun with, saying that if we are seeing Northeast in the news today, and most of the knee-jerk reactions that most of the, either from the political spectrum or from the social spectrum, that people often give, it's often because of a lack of understanding and a lack of, I would add, empathy for that region. And what these 4 plans actually highlight is that in some very weird manner, the colonial rulers did have a sense of the very complex sociological understanding of that particular region in terms of the tribal realities, in terms of the land holding patterns, in terms of the cultural, racial differences from the quote unquote mainland India. And what the post-colonial regimes have often failed to understand is that in terms of policy, in terms of approach in the last 70 years, there has been a real lack of understanding. So I just wanted to, first of all, get your thoughts as to how did you come about even in inquiring about these four plans, and what was your motive to sort of put them together, and how, like, what was your method in terms of putting these four plans together?
The motive for bringing the four plans was to provide the sources for people's understanding of what the events were in 1941 to 1946. Numerous misconceptions were there on these plans, and by putting them together on the edge of empire as four plans, I still prefer the original plans. When you read my note, which has just been presented, I quote these plans as if they were part of my work, because I'm quoting it in my book. Because the plans, you have to locate the plans in its original form, and the original forms are in archives, for which it becomes difficult to go to, and therefore I've included them in this. All the misconceptions are numerous. They also, one finds tremendous details by the anthropologists like James Mills, and these details could be used to great fruition by scholars such as those in this university and the Northeast and in JNU and elsewhere. So it's to provide information that I brought this together. It was a long and arduous search. Let me tell you that the introduction goes into a long account, not only on the four plans, but the fallout of the plans in the integration of the hills of the Northeast into independent India, and they being linked up with Assam. So the references are numerous, the footnotes are numerous, and it would be interesting for scholars to take a lead in my, if not in my note, but the footnotes from where the sources have come from. Because I've been very careful in locating material in libraries all around, and these could be put to good use by young scholars such as those in this university.
So just follow up to that. I just want to circle back to the contemporary socio-political understanding of the Northeast, and much of that seems to be stemming from what you just discussed here in terms of excluded and partially excluded areas, which has been in the post-colonial lingua franca being turned into the fifth and the sixth schedule areas. So do you feel that had these plans, I mean, this is a sort of a speculative question. Do you feel that had these plans been seriously considered by the post-colonial regime, you would have a more sensitive approach towards the region within the ambit of the dominion of India?
Not necessarily, because the Bordoloi Committee and the subsequent plans of the government of India, the 5-year plans, has put together the provision of the hill people looking after their own administration. In 1952, many district councils were put in place, and they began to function. Not that they are functioning in the best form. They're really poorly administered, but an advantage was given to them by the Constitution of India to administer themselves and their participation in the larger body politic. Before 1947, they had very little representation in the Assam legislature. And it's very interesting to find that from the hill areas, 2 clergymen were members of the Assam Legislative Assembly. I do remember reading somewhere that by the Act of 1917, there was a representation of one of the tribal chiefs in the Assam Legislative Council. And he could very often be seen on the boat going up the river Brahmaputra, pretending to read a newspaper to indicate that he was literate enough. And on close examination, the newspaper was upside down. Such were the people that the British put in. But after 1952, you do find educated members of the Legislative Assembly, and developments taking place from 1952 onwards, whether it be for the statehood of Nagaland in the early 1960s, the formation of Meghalaya, and the state's reorganization in 1971. These were all developments that came with the Indian administration. So the Indian administration, and particularly the center, we have noted that the last of the plans by Adams talks about the role of the center in the development of the hill people of Northeast India. And this does take place soon after the independence of India, with the Constitution of India taking an interest in the administration and bringing about some reforms.
Okay, I'll open up the questions to the audience at this point. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your questions. Nishant?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. It was very interesting to see the plans, and in some sense, it tells us what could have been, but then also we can also draw out what was, how they influenced what happened afterwards. So, yeah, I just wanted to ask about, in the latter respect. So people like, of course, then Verrier Elwin and others also made up these plans. And then there were later plans for the entire, tribal, the concept of the tribe later in the schedules and everything. So I was wondering how much of these notes or the thinking behind some of these were then reflected in, say, Verrier Elwin's plan, or when, they were, the Constitution was coming up with these ideas for how to govern both Northeast and also tribal areas in general within the Union. So, yeah.
Please note that Verrier Elwin did not advise for the entire Northeast. He advised only for Arunachal Pradesh. Only for Arunachal Pradesh. He was the advisor only for Arunachal. And a lot of work has been done on him recently, and much more should come out. Very interestingly, all three sons of Verrier Elwin from Leela were with me in college in Shillong between 1971 and 1974. But very sadly, neither of the three have followed in their father's footsteps. And I just wonder where the documentation will go now. So when I return, hopefully we'll make inquiries of where the photographs, he's got a marvelous collection of photographs of the tribes of central India, Madhya Pradesh, as also on Arunachal and the Nagas, and also his collection of writings. He was a prolific writer, as we know. So Elwin preferred a closed-door policy with the tribals, more like the museum pieces that some of these writers did not want them to be. They wanted these tribes to be administering themselves and not to be closed up. Whereas Elwin had a different policy when he became advisor.
Thank you so much for your talk, sir. Sorry. My question is, in your presentation, you mentioned about how there is a focus on the role of the center, and later in terms of responding to Professor Ashish's question, you talked about the sixth schedule or the self-governing policies. So it's kind of related to what Professor Ashish already asked. So I was wondering the role of the center in the contemporary time, and if say for example, if I look at Karbi Anglong or Dima Hasao, even if there is a shift schedule existence, but the administration is always trapped with the less of funding, or it becomes like a with no agency sort of a administration, which is trapped in between the Assam state government and the central. So how do you see chronology or a link with the historical writing in this place is specific to, I'm more concerned in terms of the sixth schedule area in Assam. How do you see a link? How is it been written earlier, and its effect in the contemporary time?
The Mikir Hills and the North Kachar Hills were administered differently. One area was partially excluded area and the other one was a backward area. But in 1950, by the Constitution of India, they both come under the sixth schedule and administered with district councils. One of the problems with the establishment of district councils in 1952, the first set of district councils in 1952, they had very limited power, very limited functions. It is only after the Gurkhaland and the Bodoland demand for governance that they were given special privilege and increased administrative roles. And therefore, there needs to be a review of the duties and the functions of these deputy district councils. They are in a bad shape. Financially, they don't have the resources to raise up sufficient revenue for their administration and are dependent on the states. And I've not done much study on Mikir Hills and the Karbi Anglong area. I hope to do something when I go there in November this year on a lecture note, and to go to the Deputy Commissioner's office and find out. That's one area I've not been to. But generally, I may say that the district councils are not functioning too well. In 1971, when Mizoram became a state, they did away with the deputy district councils. They were merged with the state government. And this you do not find happening in Assam and in the Meghalaya district councils.
Thank you very much. Just thinking about the crown colonies and the later plans that you discussed, there is, I think a fundamental difference between the crown colonies and what they proposed, that whole idea, Reed's idea, and what he proposed, and the subsequent plans, because the crown colonies are talking about having, an independent unit which would be remotely administered and under the, as a sort of, what do you call it, the sphere of influence of Britain, and would act not in the interests of India, but elsewhere. And the subsequent plans, however, that you talk about are talking about a certain kind of separation between hills and plains, keeping in mind the interests of the hills and the fact that the plains and the hills having different kinds of cultural positions and heterogeneity would not be advisable to be kept together. Something like that. So there is a difference between the different plans that were presented. So this is one thought that I had in mind. The second, which follows from is that despite the fact that there is a proposal for separation of hills and plains, which is happening subsequently as all of these regions are coming out of Assam and demanding statehood, it is very surprising that there is no expression of interest in these plans from within the hills hill people themselves. Now, you mentioned the fact that the people were not consulted, but then apart from Fizo, there is no other person who can be called, sort of kind of a dominant figure in the hills. There's no Laldenga there. Fizo is Fizo is supporting Japan, helping Japan. He has his reservations also about the crown colonies. He's not quite sure what he wants. And Meghalaya, you have the different CMs and all. So there's no real central figure who can, represent the people in the hills at that time. It's also a lot more it's a kind of diffuse, the situation out in the hills. But what really surprises me is that whatever it is, there's no expression of interest in in supporting the British or whatever plans that the various officers were coming up with. There's intense rebellion against the British in the hills, despite a lot of things, irrespective of Christianity, irrespective of all Lushai hills or the Naga hills, or there's no love lost between the British and this. So that really kind of surprises me. The dissent really comes out later against Assam, the domination, imposition of Assamese language and all that. So what really is happening here would be it's a little scattered, I know. I'm just trying to sort of, consolidate all of this in the form of a question, but I'm, to sum it all up, what I mean is that there are some very interesting plans that are being circulated. One of which is that there should be a separation between hills and plains. Notwithstanding this, you do not have a strong support towards these proposals coming from within the hills. Even Fizo is, not very sure of where he stands at this point. So, and Fizo is the only central figure that we can see for the pre-colonial period in the Naga hills. I'm saying that you do not have such a dominant figure in the other parts. But nevertheless, we do not really have much support for any of these plans anywhere. So this is why is that so?
Political activity came into the hills of Northeast India very, very late. In 1946 only, the Garos were organized and the Lushais were organized at about that time. The Khasis in 1923 were brought together in the Khasi National Darbar. And as I've already mentioned, it's odd that two church people were members of the Legislative Assembly. And I'm sure that they were not very active other than Nichols Roy. Please note that Nichols Roy was the most prominent of the politicians at that time, even though he was a clergyman. He was a businessman, a clergyman, a politician, and he was a very fine writer too. His collections have been brought out recently in Khasi and in English, and his thoughts are immense. But there was very little public support. I mentioned the Garos, 3 Garos writing a memoranda. So you do get these little snippets of opposition or support. And it was generally not a large one as Reed would have wanted, because it never percolated down to the people. And that was one of the failures by the Crown Party. But more than that, I think it was ill-timed. It was just not brought out at the right time. There is a note in the India Office Library that were these plans brought in 1930, perhaps they would have taken shape if they were brought in earlier 1930. But then
why is that so?
Because the Government of India Act was to be implemented after the Statutory Commission report. The Indian Statutory Commission report 1928 to 1930 called for a reorganization of India's constitutional framework. And then the Government of India Act 1935 came into operation. So if it would have been brought as early as 1930, then perhaps it could have been. This is just one stray idea that I noted.
But Professor Syiemlieh, what really strikes me as interesting is the fact that despite Inner Line, despite all this sympathy with the hills, and I take my cue from Ashish's comment that probably in the colonial period, there's more empathy towards the hills than in the post-colonial times. What strikes me is that political activity in the hills, which is anti-colonial resistance, although not in an organized form, is happening way early. if you take Tirot Singh, if you take many other figures who are, vehemently protesting against British, intrusion. Despite inner line, this doesn't stop because there are predatory raids into the hills, etc. So there's no love lost between the British government, whether or not, what I'm trying to say is that whether or not the hills people, organized or not organized, wanted separation from the plains of Assam, they definitely did not want anything to do with the British government at that point, because there is evidence of a very serious anti-colonial resistance in the hills for whatever the reasons. And so that's even pre-national movement and nationalism and all that.
It does not continue into much of colonial time. It was only in the initial years of their annexation. It does not continue into the latest phase. Maybe because administration comes in, the force of law, the impact of a new faith, which many of the tribes accept. These were changes that make them rather accept British rule rather than to resist.
Okay, we can talk about this later. Thank you very much. And
There's one question from Ajay Chakrabarti. Is it not that far from the very beginning? Is it not that from the very beginning of British Crown, they just wanted to get a road to reach Burma through Assam and the northeast frontier, and they had little or no civilization or Christianization policy?
I've not seen any reference to the construction of a road. There was no reference to the construction of a road. Because if you know the boundary between Burma and India, it's a very mountainous region. And even today, there is very little communication other than the frontier outposts in Manipur and one in Nagaland. As for, they had little or no civilization and Christianizing policy. In fact, it's amazing to find that none of the 4 plans which I've made reference to make very much reference to the impact of Christianity or a desire to spread the word like the missionaries do. They were very particular as administrators to keep away from making comments in their notes on the impact of Christianity, though they, in other references, are rather critical, as I have noted elsewhere in a publication, on the impact of Christianity on the tribes of Northeast. But during the war, you have the Stillwell Road. You have the Stillwell Road. But that must have had economic reasons for it, and also some strategic reasons for it.
Jeep Barua, how can we contextualize the current interstate boundary issues in the northeastern region with the colonial line system, as the demands for redrawing the boundary in the northeast region, for example, the demand for greater Nagalim, has its viability in the colonial administrative arrangements?
Yes, the boundaries of Northeast India have taken a tribal context, whether it's the Nagaland, but there are issues there because the Nagas are living in other parts of the Northeast too, as also in Burma. So similar is the situation with the Mizos. They got the statehood but recently, and they are also scattered in very many parts of Northeast, including tribes akin to them are in Manipur and also in Burma. These are very difficult issues to form, and I'm not really very fluent in the boundary issues. I go to 1946, 1947, and I find I don't have the material enough to make comments, as has been raised by this question.
I think, are there any final questions from the audience here? If not, thank you. So if not, I think I would like to draw this wonderful session to a close. And I think it was wonderful to have you here in person and to engage on this very little known but very impactful policy document that continues to shape at least much of the imaginations that people have regarding the Northeast. So on that note, I, on behalf of the Humanities and Social Sciences Department, extend a warm note of gratitude and thank you and Kublai to Professor David. And we hope to have further discussions with you in the future. So I would like all of us to join and give him a round of applause.